Hello, everybody. Good to see folks. Give people a moment to get on. Hope you're here to talk about superstorms and disasters and solutions. Actually, we're talking about solutions more than anything. So let folks get on here. We have quite a list of folks who registered. So, how's everybody's day going? I see some nods. Good.
Hectic but productive.
Yeah, I feel the same way. It's been a productive but lots happening day. It's interesting. Back when we first started about doing this class, we were talking about superstorms, and because we thought, well, storms. That's the disaster of the winter is the rain and the wind. But as of the last few days, it's also been a lot of fire. So we'll be touching on that too. So welcome. A little housekeeping. My name is Charles Williams. I'm with Earth Activist Training, and it's great to see you all. We're recording this on Zoom. The recording is going to be shared out with everybody here. It's not public on Zoom right now, so if you saw that it's being recorded, it's not like live out everywhere, but we're going to be sharing it with you and anybody else who registered for the course. So keep an eye out afterwards if you're looking for the recording. And if you're watching this in recording, here you go. This is the recording for you. And yeah, so tonight, this afternoon, we're going to be talking about disasters and storms and like, what do we do? Like these things are happening. They're more and more common all the time. We've got, these giant fires. We've got, tornadoes and hurricanes, and they've always happened in the past. They're just getting bigger and more frequent. And we need to start thinking about how do we want to orient ourselves personally in our personal lives around it, and then how do we want to orient our communities and our neighborhoods and our regions around these things, because like any storm, it doesn't hit just one of us, it hits lots of us, and sometimes we're the ones impacted, in that it directly hits us. Sometimes it impacts more directly as somebody nearby, a neighbor, a neighboring community, and then we have people come to us and we become the mutual aid, we become the support. So even if we're not the direct, we don't get the direct kind of brunt of a natural impact, we may be the ones that are supporting. So we're going to kind of touch on a lot of that this afternoon. Maybe Chris, if you want to add anything.
Hey everybody. Yeah, no, I won't add too much to that, Charles. I'll kind of save for my part, but just sending some some good intentions out. Man, there's some people dealing with some wild stuff right now. It's pretty, yeah, it's almost unfathomable thinking about what's happening in LA right now. So just want to kind of hold them in our hearts, all the people, and also the land too, all the animals, the wildlife. We're often very focused on the impact on people, but this is also having an impact on water. It's having an impact on air, which of course carries off to the birds and everybody else. Um, and another one maybe I'll even put on the radar is, it's not quite a superstorm, but there's a lot going on with the evolution of the bird flu virus right now, and that's impacting a lot of wildlife too. There's been a lot of deaths in wild bird populations, and so just want to hold that in a good way and send some prayers out there to that, and hopefully we're gonna take this conversation in a really positive way in a pretty in somewhat intimidating scenario in times.
Yeah. So I think I'm gonna lead us off today, and talk a little bit landscape and kind of how we're gonna approach this. So before I lead off, I just want to acknowledge where I am. Usually I'm up in Atlantic Canada, but today I'm down in California in the traditional lands of the Miwok, and just I'm grateful to be here. And I want to give some gratitude to the lands that I'm on and those who have tended it over the centuries and millennia. So get this to go. Give me 1 second as I get set up here. Now, okay. Oops, get back here. I just lost my screen. We're gonna try it again.
Yeah, I'll jump in for a second while you're pulling that up, Charles. Maybe one other thing I'll just throw into the conversation here while Charles is getting the presentation ready. It's not really the theme of tonight's talk, but I do want to just kind of name it because I feel like it's kind of the elephant in the room, and that a lot of people kind of feel a lot of almost like anxiety around the state of the world and climate change and stuff like that. Some of the disasters we're seeing, and just acknowledging that there really is a psychological component of this. We're going to be talking about design principles tonight. We're going to be talking about, how permaculture can be supportive. I'm going to be getting into kind of almost more like tactical aspects of how we can prepare for superstorms. But I just want to acknowledge, if you feel that inside you, a lot of people are feeling grief right now around these things. A lot of people have some nervousness, some anxiety. Some people even find themselves in depression. I want to acknowledge those as real. And say that, showing up and being around people that support you is an important part of that. And another important part of this story that I think is, so I think about this stuff all the time. It's a major component of my work. And one thing I've found really supportive is actually thinking about our human story, our personal vision, and even our mythology as it relates to change and challenge. And that's the part that I actually find that empowers me and pushes me forward and actually makes me step up with my best self in challenging times. And, just to acknowledge that people have been facing challenging times since people have been people. And we've been through so much. Where I come from, I'm up in northeastern Canada, in the province of Ontario. It's what it's called today. But the traditional peoples of these lands, the Anishinaabe, like they have stories about literally in their oral tradition, talk about the glaciers coming down from the north and then receding back. That's how far their oral lineage goes. But can you imagine being a people with an evolved, advanced society and glaciers literally coming in and pushing you off and the temperature changing drastically? Peoples have gone through those types of shifts, massive warmings and coolings throughout history. And in some ways, I see it as being built into our blueprint. So we're not going to really dive into that aspect of this tonight, but I do just want to encourage you to kind of think about, what is your mythology? What is your story? What is your role, your vision as it relates to this? And if you're feeling a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of even depression around it, then maybe you can source a little bit of strength, bravery, even inspiration from thinking about that piece right there. So I'll just leave that little seed with folks as we start the night off.
Thanks, Chris. Well, I also similarly want to start off with, what are we afraid of? Like when we say superstorms, like what is it? And I encourage you just toss in the chat. What are some of the things that come up when you hear, natural disaster or, storm or, flood or, like these things that we talk about? What are some of the things that come up as some of the things you're concerned about? Yeah, that's easy. About the human suffering. Yeah, losing communication. Yeah, lots of home instability. Yeah, I think about this, watching what's going on with LA, just losing that which is familiar. Water, security and survival, stability. Medical care, yeah. Worried about vulnerable populations. Yeah, loss of loved ones, human and all the others. Losing ID documents that, in our society, yeah, that it's huge. Yeah, there's so many things that we, I think, can be worried about when we talk about storms. And I want to walk down into some of that a little bit and think about it. What it is. We see these images, it flashes across news screens, and of course, they're picking ones that are particularly dramatic, right? That we see. And I wonder, like, how do we navigate this? And I think a lot of times when we talk about natural disasters, it's not the natural part of it. Like ecology has evolved to be around fires and floods and winds, but what we worry about is what happens, like road closures. And when a road closes, how about food? How about connection to the ones we love? How about medical assistance? All the things that come in and out of our roads. loss of power, electricity. And, how do our refrigerators stay on, or the lights go on, or our phones work, or, again, medical attention, like all these things that are linked to the systems that we have created in our modern society. Like we rely on these things for our really basic human needs. And when we start to have roads blow out, or power lines go down, or, floods that force us to leave our homes, or damage, as trees fall, or damage happens to our home. Like these are the type of things that I think are what the crisis are, the nature of the crisis. The crisis isn't big winds blowing. The crisis is we can't turn the lights on, and it's hard to feed ourselves or take care of ourselves or connect with our loved ones. And so, this lack of access to critical resources. And Chris will talk more about this too. I think one of the challenges we face when we're talking about crisis is that we can be crisis focused. We want to find a solution to that one thing, and then we lose track of a bigger picture we live in. We live in this larger ecology, this natural world that we care about. We live in this larger regional relationship with people and creatures, and cycles and systems. So I want to, as we talk through how do we work with natural disasters and think about how we might work with landscapes, we also think about what are the other services landscapes provide, and design into that. Design something better overall, and not just solve one single problem. Shailene, you have a hand up?
Well, one of the things that I feel is that the built environment is the problem. We can build the environment to be inclusive of all body minds and pretty much all situations, but we don't. And, you can say capitalism, you can say greed, you can say corporations, you can say all of it. And a lot of it is true. It's like it's one of those yes and moments. But I think the really important answer to that, I mean, I'm gonna put a ball out there that has everything inside it, and that is mutual aid and resilience and communications with each other. Because my job is to help people plan ahead for these sorts of things. But the kind of planning ahead that I'm talking about is like, okay, you require an elevator to get out of the building in which you live because you're on the third floor, and not everybody can be on the first floor, right? And so there have to be plans for this, but there aren't. And that's a huge one. And there's a lot more where that came from. But it's all about planning. It's about, if you think there's going to be a problem, get out before you're boxed in. But that requires forethought, that people have to be trained to think like and do.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Sheila. I think you're completely right. We've got these design challenges, and humans are great at designing things if we think broadly enough about them, and design well. And I'm going to talk more about that a little later on. But I want to start with trees, as in landscapes. I try to figure out where to start with. It's a huge issue. Like, how do you start to design these systems that will support all sorts of disasters? Like, how do we start to design our landscapes in a way that can deal with floods and fires and storms? And I want to just start with plants and vegetation, because they're one of the concerns. Oftentimes I hear people say, oh, we should cut down the trees. We don't want them to fall on things, because that's what takes out the power lines. That's what takes out the roof. That's what closes the road. Take out the trees. But trees are really important. They've evolved in place, especially native trees. And they do all these great things that we want. Like, when a storm's not going on, they help cool us and create shade. So we don't have heat islands in our cities, and they provide habitat, which is critical for life. Like, we need habitat for all the wildlife that live around us. And many of our food crops, need the ecology, that not just the fields. We need that ecology around it. We need to, they help reduce flooding. Trees are a huge mitigator for flood damage. They can calm the wind. They increase the humidity. When we look at fire landscapes, and this is something that you can see in fire-prone areas, like a few degrees of humidity can make a huge difference whether a spark will ignite or not. So increasing just the general humidity, that's the keeping places damper, and trees are good at that. So instead of saying we should remove all the trees and like pave the landscape so that there's nothing can burn or that nothing can will fall over, I think we need to think more holistically about this. How do we want to come into the space? And there's some good rules when we think about trees. So if you're thinking about, having trees in your landscape, which are these good things that provide for health and well-being, or even lower blood pressure, if you're looking at trees, they calm people. But we want to use good, strong trees. Like the type of tree that we have becomes important. So when we start to design our spaces, the type of vegetation, it becomes more critical. And especially in urban environments, we talk about ecology, native ecologies. Well, an urban environment is a particular ecology, and rural environments are a particular ecology that are not native ecologies. The native ecology didn't have roads and skyscrapers in them. So we want to have trees that are native as much as possible, ones that are there, and the trees that do well in disturbance. So we have things like the oaks. Oak trees are really great. They're very strong. They usually have deep roots. They're hard to blow over. Their branches are both strong and flexible. So in windstorms, they don't break. And they're arguably the most important wildlife tree out there. Not because of the acorns as much, which is one big part, but also because there's so many insects that live on oak leaves. They're the #1 food for migrating birds. They're a primary food source for so many animals. Hundreds of animals live, different species exist off an oak tree. And that isn't true of other trees. So like having oak trees, and I'm not talking about the towering giant oaks. There's a lot of varieties. There's shorter ones, more compact ones that fit in different spaces. So how do we have trees like the oak and the holly and the willow, ones that are strong and flexible, the birches and the dogwoods, the ones that can withstand wind without breaking or falling over. Things like cedars, some of the evergreen trees that are flexible, but have good stable root systems. So we want to think about some of the trees. So these are some, I've listed some here on this slide. Depending on your bioregion, they can vary a little bit, but there are trees that do better than others. Things like elms, prone to breaking, and are often trees that are planted in urban and suburban areas. They grow fast, and they're popular, but they also break really easy, and they're the ones that you see a lot of times taking out houses and breaking power lines. So we want to think about what we have for trees and really working with the natives as much as we can. And you'll notice some of these are not native on this list, but as much as possible, we're looking for natives. So if you're going to plant some trees and you're worried about storms, here are a few good rules that we want to think about. We're going to plant them in groups. A single tree by itself, trees didn't really evolve to live by themselves. They're kind of social beings. They like to live in groups. It makes them stronger, more resistant to wind. So having trees in groups instead of singles. Having a diversity, a variety of them instead of one particular variety. They'll have different rooting profiles in the soil. They'll have different leaf profiles in the air, so they disturb the air in different ways. And this will make the whole group of trees stronger. You want to maintain healthy tree crown. So this is pruning often. If you're in an urban environment or even in suburban environments, you may want to do some pruning on the trees. This is avoiding the thing you see under power lines, which is kind of like the just chop it off anywhere variety, but it's like pruning to have a balanced tree that's not leaning one way or the other, and has healthy air movement. And if a tree falls, plant a new one, preferably one that is, does well in the storms that you're likely to get in your area. So think about the vegetation. If you're in a fire-prone area, you're going to want to think about trees that are fire resistant also, and ones that don't leave a lot of litter on the ground, or ones that you can manage the litter that falls off them, that leaves and bark flakes and sticks and things like that. Other things to consider when you're thinking about trees. Yeah, you want to give them adequate root space. And this is something that is commonly a problem when you see trees that have blown over, is they either are a variety that it doesn't tolerate wind very well, or their roots have been impacted. You know, if you've ever walked down a city sidewalk, and between the street and the sidewalk, there's that little grassy strip that we get trees in sometimes. They'll grow up and like buckle the sidewalks and whatnot. Like, you want to plant small trees in those places, not really big ones that their root system is the appropriate size for the space they have. So small trees, you're talking about like a 10-foot by 10-foot square. You know, larger trees, you might be 30 by 30. If you're talking, I mean, these are like park trees or, you know, forest trees. You need more space. So you want to make sure you give them adequate space if you're going to have them. You want to avoid the anchor roots, like cutting them. And this often happens when people do development, when people do renovations or building, or if roads are being fixed and things like that, like cutting those roots. So about 5 times the diameter of the tree. So if you think how big around the tree is, like 5 times that size is about how far away you want, where you're not cutting major roots. So make sure the roots have enough depth, and avoid codominant stems. And codominant is when you have a tree that branches off and has 2 main stems that go up at the same time. So you often just see this where you have a main trunk and then it splits into 2 main trunks that go up, and they often break at those points. So having good, strong dominant trees. And things like pines, they've found that those trees are also very, they don't fall down the first storm that comes through, but they often get stressed in storms, and they weaken and they fall down in the 3rd or 4th storm. So a lot of times, just keeping good track of how your trees are doing. It's like keeping track of your friends. How are they doing? Check them out, talk to them, hang out with them, see how they're doing. Make sure they're staying healthy. So we want to think about what we plant around our spaces, because we can have vegetation. We just want to put the appropriate vegetation. And the other thing we want to think about in vegetation is this idea of infiltration and interception. And this is something plants do all the time. If you've ever walked through a field after the dew, like in the morning, like a field of grass where it's been dewy, or after a rainfall, you might have taken a walk in the woods, and you notice that you get totally soaked, even though it's not raining, right? You've brushed up against plants, they get you wet, you can be totally soaked, and there has not been any rain for a while. It's not actively falling, right? That's interception. And I'll come back to that. I have this slide first. So when rain happens in a watershed, in a region where you have a waterfall, the rain will fall and it starts to move towards the rivers, the creeks, and the streams. Right? It's moving downhill. If rain, when it falls, immediately the first thing hits is something impermeable, like a rooftop. It runs off that very quickly. And maybe it drains off that and hits a driveway, which has been compacted. It runs off that really quickly. So within seconds of a raindrop hitting the ground, like falling through the air, it hits a rooftop, and then a driveway, and then a road, and then now it's very quickly it moves into a creek or a stream, like it's being directed to a waterway. And this is classic design, like get the water out, get it away. You know, we don't want water by our structures, we don't want water on the landscape, and it's drying the landscape out, but it's moving the water very quickly away, right? So if we have rain, a heavy rainstorm where water falls, you know, in this image I have these little storm clouds, and all that water runs off quickly, it all very quickly converges wherever the streams or rivers come together. And rivers and streams go underneath roads. And this is where you blow out culverts. This is where you have this bulge of water that all rushes very quickly to our waterways. And then especially these larger storms that haven't been designed for, like we're washing out roads and we're washing out culverts. Those are the pipes that go underneath the roads. And we're gullying out hillsides and things like that. But we don't necessarily have to have that happen. So you can see in this graph on the top right, the kind of jagged line is rainfall. When rain first starts, it starts kind of slow, but it amps up pretty fast. You have your big rain dump, and then it slowly tapers off. That's kind of how a rainstorm happens. You know, the rain's coming, it's coming, then it falls pretty quickly and heavily, and then it tapers back. As that rain runs through our landscape, if the landscape is impermeable, we get this dashed line where it peaks high, where you get a lot of damage because the water speed and energy is so high and it's all together at once and it comes down. If we can slow that water land so that the same amount of water is moving off the landscape, but slower. So like maybe one place it moves from a roof to a driveway into the stream, another place it hits a tree leaf and runs down to tree leaf and then down the stem and down the bark, and then it gets onto the soil, and then it weaves its way through sticks and grasses and roots and slowly goes to the stream. Like by slowing it down, you spread out the intensity of the water. It doesn't all hit the stream at the same time. And that means you have less damage to our infrastructure. So we want to slow it down. We want to intercept some of that water with vegetation because it's the best thing to do. It makes a longer path for that one drop of water to weave its way into our streams and rivers, and then down to often where our roads and our rivers run together. So using vegetation, having vegetation to absorb some of that, collecting it on the stems and the branches. And in a healthy ecosystem, you can have conifer trees that are intercepting. They're holding on to 25 to 35% of the annual precipitation. So if you think about it, having a big storm, if you can hold on to 25% of that rain or 35% of that snow, deciduous trees, 15 to 25, like a quarter of the water that falls in a big storm could be held on vegetation versus heading into the streams. It can make a huge difference to what we have for flooding. So think about vegetation, especially trees, as a way in which to decrease the flooding that we have and the erosion power we have. So, and the difference between conifer and deciduous is conifer trees, since they have needles year round, they can intercept in the winter, especially snow. That's why it has a higher number. So we're going to think about trees. We're going to have a diverse number of trees, have an abundant. Then we can do some, of our design in our landscape. These are our rain gardens. Like, where can we start to hold in small places the water on our landscape? Where can we start to, grow vegetation that's going to help stabilize the wind? If you've ever been in urban environments where you have the wind tunnel effect, so windy, like vegetation can decrease that, but it also can decrease storm winds. So we're going to try to harvest some of that water, creates more humidity in our landscapes, and that humidity also can decrease fire danger. So, when you look at LA, if anybody's been in LA, like how much of it is designed to shunt water out of the space because they have a flooding issue. So their strategy has been to move water out of the landscape, which makes a much drier city. So how do we start to rehydrate our landscapes and decrease our flooding, rehydrate our landscapes? Can we start to collect it on green roofs and in rain barrels, in gardens? Can we green our cities a little more? Can we green our environments more? Can we hold on to some of that water? And so much of the design has been moving water off the landscape, moving it back on the landscape. Though it seems like counterintuitive to flooding, it actually helps because the healthier our water cycle is, the better we can handle floods. So other strategies, we have things like porous pavement, which is where we have pavement that allows water to get into the ground. We have like our bioswales and our swales to collect water. And one more on a landscape level is beaver dams. And they're one of our primary methods for decreasing flooding, flash flooding, where you have water like pooling in unusual spaces, because beavers are really good about pooling them in planned spaces. So thinking about how we might be able to use and support some of the natural systems that used to be out there that maintained our water cycle that we don't have now. So I want to think about things like beaver dams, and BDAs are beaver dam analogs. These are beaver dams that humans make when beavers have been removed from an area. I see your hand. I'll get to you in a minute. And another part that I don't have time to touch on tonight, but I'm looking forward to talking more about, is disaster architecture. So we have an architecture, an aesthetic, a way of building, and whole industry built around houses and structures that conform to a particular code that come from a colonial past, but they also burn really easily. They're not really resistant to wind. Think about, where did the houses we live in, where did they evolve? Where did this structure come from? Where are we modeling it after? Were those places that had high winds? Were there places that had catastrophic fires? Were they ones that had flooding? Or are we having a building style that is one that's evolved from a place that didn't have those, and in a way for economics? They're cheap and easy to build, versus they last long, they're resistant to disturbance. So there's a whole disaster architecture that's coming into the conversation. Like, how do we want to build and rebuild? Like, if we have disasters happen, how do we allow for people to come back, the right of return to their homes, and then be able to rebuild? But how do we not rebuild the same thing that failed last time? How do we start to look at and say, oh, what curvilinear spaces don't catch the wind so much? Like square buildings, they catch the wind. They're very wind prone. Like rounding spaces and rounding edges, like a lot of indigenous structures were. Can we start to use lower profiles? Can we start to look at what we make it out of, the substances we use that are less prone to burning or to water damage through flooding, our foundations and things like that. So when you think about the architecture, how can we use natural building? And the whole natural building movement has such great tools for designing for disaster. And the final thing I want to touch on before I pass it over to Chris is that we have this thing that's happening, and it happens in almost every disaster. Is a disaster happens, and then we throw the environmental laws out the window to rebuild because it's cheaper and easier. However, some of those environmental laws and some of those regulations that we would have before, they were in place for a really good reason. Instead of getting rid of the environmental laws, things like water quality monitoring. So when you build, often you do a lot of soil disturbance. A lot of that soil then goes into the waterways, which is hard on fish and invertebrates, ocean life. Like, how do we say, oh no, we want to actually keep the sediment out of our streams? Still, that's important, and still have people to be able to come back. Like, how do we allow for that? How do we say, oh, a road has been blown out, like a culvert didn't work? How do we not drop the same failing culvert back into there? And maybe we take a little more time and make a wildlife crossing, a space that could both allow for more water to go through, but allow wildlife to cross under our roads instead of over them, which is another problem we have with segmenting our wild spaces. So there's no corridors anymore. Like, how can we envision coming out of disaster, not just coming into disasters, but coming out of them with a plan to make something better versus just what we had? And this is where there's some real work to be done. It's like, okay, how can we not throw our values out of the window, some values out of the window for other ones, return of housing for environmental regulation, but how do we do both of them and do them both so well that it makes a better system overall? And we can. We're good at designing. And I'll come back to this slide a little later. These are about some classes we have coming up. Okay. We had a hand.
It was mine, I think.
Sheila, yeah.
So you were talking about trees and planting trees and how to do it strategically, I guess is the word I want. And what I wanted to ask you is, I was talking to a birder recently, and she said, don't take all the leaves and all the detritus from the trees from your ground.
Mhm.
Birds use them, bugs live in them, and birds eat the bugs and all that stuff. But where is the balance between making things good for ecology and good for life forms and yet protecting against fire? I know that we're supposed to keep stuff 30 feet away from our buildings, but I'm a renter and I can do some to uh, make my yard be a certain way, but I have a landlord and he only put one tree in, and
Yep.
I don't even know what tree it is. I'm totally blind and I haven't studied this stuff, and I would love to touch the different leaves of different trees and try to learn all of it, and I would love to learn more about herbology. But anyway, I just
Yep.
what can renters do, and people who like the logistics of me potting plants and things is not going to happen, but what little things can I do to
Yeah,
um,
so I'm a renter too. I rent. I live on the fourth story. I have no control over my yard. Like I understand this exact challenge. Like how do we do this? And some of the things are not individual problems; they're collective problems. So like they're like urban forestry problems. They're ones that we work with together with other people. So sometimes we work with our yards if we have access to them. Sometimes we work with our, our landlords and stuff. And like there is there's some renters who've done this awesome thing. They've organized themselves. There's immigrant communities that live near me that have organized themselves, and they basically went to the landlords and said, "Hey, we rent the building. You pay for landscape maintenance, mowing and trimming and all this stuff." They said, "We will take care of the landscape if you let us plant." And they've actually started whole community gardens on the little strips around the building, because it became cost effective. Like the landlords are like, sure, if I don't have to pay for landscaping and you want to take care of it and you live there and you don't do anything that's going to damage the building, they had all the caveats, like it can't be dangerous, whatever. But and they're like, sure, we'll do that. And now they're growing their food there. And a food garden is not fire prone. Like there's a lot of water there. Like lettuce doesn't burn well, So that was a really great solution in their case. Like there's going to be different cases. And this idea that you can't have things right up against the building in fire-prone areas. Yeah, you don't want burnable things against your buildings. But that doesn't mean you can't have things in your landscapes. Like you have a walkway, right? Why is there a walkway on not closer to our building, but far away? The typical thing is walkway, the street, walkway, vegetation, building, right? Like, can we switch those around? Like, why not? Why not put the access to your house closer in and the vegetation a little farther out? Because you still want vegetation, you still want shade. You still can have, the leaf matter and the mulches and like the stuff on the ground. You just don't want them touching your building, right? So what you have, how do you access your house anyway? Because you do walk there somehow, right? So how do you think about that differently in a fire-prone area? What vegetation do you have? And really, there's also this part about keeping soil moisture. I did fire defense. I firefighter for many years, and one of the things that was important is, can you get to a fire to put it out? If a flame is like 3 or 4 foot high and you have a fire hose, like absolutely go for it. If you have a 30-foot flame, a big, like too hot, you can't get too close. So if you're driving down the street and you're like, okay, what am I going to put out? The 4-foot flame or the 30-foot flame? You put out the 4-foot flame. So when we talk about mulches on the ground, they don't make high flame height. They're fine. What we worry about is ladder fuels that move that flame up into the brush and then into the canopies and make these huge, high, hot flames. That's when you have fire defense is really hard. So I wouldn't worry about your like leaf detritus that you've kind of put around your plants as being like a huge fire danger, as long as it's not touching the building, because that's defensible fire space, which is different than like all the shrubs that ladder from the ground up to the shrubs, up into the mid canopy, up to the canopy, and you have these huge roaring high flames and you can't even get close to it because it's too hot. So we're not against fire. We're just against fire in human environment, in close to human places that you can't defend from. So I'm not suggesting we make parking lots, because that makes flooding problems and erosion problems. That's a bigger picture, right? Anyway, we could go hours and hours on this, and I want to pass it off to Chris because he has some great stuff coming.
Awesome. Thanks, Charles. That was great. And great question there, Sheila. I could rip on that one for a while too, and I won't. Some of the actual courses we're going to talk about coming up, we actually are going to go into some of those topics in much more depth. Maybe just the one other little piece that I would add to that is an actual resource that might interest you. It's a Canadian resource, but it would absolutely apply to everyone here from the US or even Europe, wherever you're coming from. But there's an organization called Fire Smart Canada. Maybe Charles, you can put that in the app, Fire Smart Canada, and they actually have a home audit that you can do for fires. And, if I don't know if you have a background in permaculture at all, Sheila. I know a number of folks on here, but, in permaculture, we often talk about this idea of like the permaculture zones. But that concept of zones can also be applied to fire management. And depending on the risk level, so you can use something like the fire audit to determine like, well, is my building high risk or lower risk in the first place? Can I reduce it? And then you can think about those zones. And, often I'm a component of, as you get closer to the middle zone, so right around my building, you may have a little bit less diversity if there's a higher fire risk. If the fire risk is lower, then, you need to do less to kind of guard that. But as you work out, ideally, you're becoming kind of more and more, or I should say less and less tended by the human as you move out there. And as you get closer, you might be a little more tended based on your needs. That diverse was the wrong word, because it doesn't necessarily mean less diverse on the middle. It just means more tended and intentional about what that diversity looks like to actually mitigate against that fire risk. So I'll just leave it there because we could really unpack that. And we actually are going to dive into that in one of the courses that we're going to chat about at the end of tonight. So in the emergency disaster course. But anyways, I'm going to share my screen here. And yeah, I want to pick up where Charles shared off with actually a quick example. I actually just kind of added this improv on the fly here. And then Charles has been kind of talking about natural landscape design. I'm going to go in a little bit of a different direction now and take us into kind of bridging traditional emergency management frameworks and disaster management frameworks with the best of kind of permaculture thought. And we're going to get into almost some kind of like tactical approaches on bridging those two worlds and some methodologies for starting to think about our planning. But first, I do want to just pick up on this thread because as Charles was talking, I thought, oh, here's a great working example that I actually applied quite recently on my homestead here. So I'll share this story relatively quickly, and then I'll dive into my piece. Can everyone see that okay? We're good?
Yeah, it's looking good.
Awesome.
Actually, can you...
oh, yeah. I could probably go full screen, I guess, eh?
Probably can do a full screen.
Yeah, give me 1 second. Play. Here we go. Is that better?
Yeah, it looks great.
Awesome. So just to be really quick on this example, because then I could teach a whole class on what's going on here. But so this is actually my home, the little homestead that my wife and I live on, and the land that we're fortunate to tend. And we basically acknowledged a risk behind our house. There's actually a couple risks going on here. One of them is we have this south-facing hillside here, which means if you look up the hill, you're going to the north and the west. It's actually northwest that hill kind of faces. The most strong and dominant winds from our area often come out of the northwest. And we had a bunch of tree species growing on that hillside that were particularly susceptible to wind damage, things like white birch and poplar trees. And we had one giant oak that was literally leaning over the house. And we have a little bit of concern with oak wilt coming up to the area here, which is devastating oak trees a little bit south of us right now. So we had a concern about with increasing winds. We've actually seen an increase in tornadoes in our region in the last little while. So we had a concern about those trees potentially falling down on the house. So we did cut them out, but like just cutting out trees is not a solution to any kind of environmental problem or climate change or disaster preparedness. Because by cutting out the trees, we've now created a secondary problem in that we now have a south-facing hill that faces towards our house. So now by taking down those trees, you actually increase the risk of flooding, right? There's a give and take with all of these different things, which is why, I work in professional emergency management. I used to actually work for a large firm and work with municipalities, hospitals, things like that. And unfortunately, even in our modern emergency management today, we're often very narrow-sighted, or we manage for one component and we forget about how that's going to create another problem down the road. It's like, oh, we're worried about fires. Well, let's cut all the trees and pave over everything. And then all of a sudden we have a historic flood. This happens all the time from urban planners and modern emergency management folks. Not to rip on that. There's some amazing tools in there. But that's where I really feel that permaculture actually has a lot to offer the modern emergency management world, and vice versa. There's a lot we can take from that world to apply to our permaculture work. So long story short, what we've basically done is we've come up with a system in the middle here that's going to mitigate against water and flooding. It's going to mitigate against wind. It's also mitigating against invasive species and food loss for wildlife species, while reducing our carbon footprint by creating food near us and food for our rabbits. which also reduces our carbon footprint. So I'm not going to give you the whole design here, but the essence of the steps here is we decided, what are we going to do about this hill? We cut down the trees that were a risk. So we did take down a bunch of trees because they were higher risk. And what we're doing in place, actually, before we even get there, that big pile of logs, there's three byproducts that are coming out of cutting down those trees. One, we've got firewood for our home. We use wood heat, so great. There's actually firewood for the home, so that's saving us money and making us more self-reliant. Number two, on the right side of that picture, those are all logs that are cut and inoculated with mushroom logs. So if we're going to cut down those trees, why not grow food out of them, right? So we've inoculated those with shiitake and oyster mushrooms for growing food. Once those logs go through their life cycle of producing mushrooms, they'll go back into the soil and help build that soil layer again that Sheila was just highlighting is so important. Now, that talks about what we did with the trees, but now we've got the flooding risk there. So with the flooding risk, we're replanting this as a multi-layer forest garden. And in the forest garden design, we're actually planting tree species that grow slightly south of us. Things like walnuts and hickories and hazelnut trees, because those trees are Carolinian species that grow a little south of us. Climate change is suggesting that they are going to begin to grow in our area in the coming generations. And I've got a big concern. Our beech trees are already dying. Second most important wildlife tree. And oak wilt could hit us one day. And like Charles said, oak is our most important wildlife tree. So thinking ahead a few generations, I'm thinking, okay, well, let's start planting trees that are providing an alternate nut source if that oak gets taken out and the beech already are. So we're actually increasing species diversity, thinking long-term about wildlife and climate change independence. And we're planting these trees in a new way. Those walnut trees and the nut trees are going to be way less susceptible to wind damage than the birch and the poplar that were growing there in the first place. Right, so we're now planting trees that are going to be hardier to that wind damage in the first place, and are also solving a food problem for the wildlife, but also will be able to harvest that food as well. And there's a lot more going on to this as well. I've also thought about fires. I've thought about quite a few things in the design, and we can't get into all of that right now. But I just thought that was a really interesting example there. And here's a group. We had a class last summer. We ran an in-person 2-day forest gardening workshop. So we're planting hazelnuts along there. And of course, the hazelnuts don't grow tall enough to be a wind problem in the first place. So, okay. So anyways, on to my kind of formal piece here, though. So, sorry, give me a second. I'm just going to share this again. So I'm not going to actually share a lot about my background. I think some of you have heard that, and we'll save that one for another day. But I think why I just wanted to share this and why I think it's relevant right now, my big passion in my work right now is bridging the world of modern emergency and disaster management with permaculture, knowledge of ecology and nature, and community skill sets. And this feels really important to me because I've been really fortunate and privileged to work in both worlds. I've been involved in the permaculture world for over 20 years now. It was 20 years ago when I first came across Starhawk's work in Earth Activist Training. My wife did her PDC with Starhawk a number of years ago. And then in the last decade, I actually went back to school, started studying emergency and disaster management. You can see a picture of me. That was in the bottom left there in that orange shirt. I got to be part of a wide-scale emergency exercise done at the World Conference on Disaster Management, where we literally had people from all over the world, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, and Britain, and England, and Germany, all coming together, the heads of state, the heads of emergency departments, to talk about disasters, the future disasters, and what we're doing to mitigate. And I believe that there's actually some real big opportunities right now to bridge these worlds that the world really, really needs. And as somebody who practices permaculture, I think this also creates an opportunity for you, because the reality of this world is money in income is the real thing. And there are opportunities to actually make money helping businesses, helping communities. I can't remember if that was Sheila or someone else, the first question that got asked. Or the first comment, they were talking about how there's, a lot of buildings, organizations, businesses don't actually have the right things in place. As disasters increase in intensity, there's actually an opportunity for us as permaculturalists to actually expand our resumes and expand our income streams by offering a service to organizations, to schools, to summer camps, to festivals, to eco-villages, to farms, to municipalities and governments. provincial or state level, in holistic emergency management. And when I say holistic emergency management, I'm speaking about basically bridging kind of the best of like permaculture and homesteading thoughts with a knowledge of nature and ecology, knowledge of place, which is often missing in EM, with the best tools of EM. Because, you know, I keep sounding like I'm dissing EM, but there's some phenomenal tools that have been developed in EM and some systems there with community and relationships, which creates the opportunity to make things more equitable and more fair in the first place. So I just kind of wanted to highlight the opportunity I think that exists there. Some of you that work in this field, or maybe you want to get into working in this field, this could be a way to serve your community, but also generate income at the same time and be a win-win in the world. A model I'm going to touch on really quick, and then I'm going to share a framework for you. Oh, please. Oh, was someone saying something? No? Oh, okay. I thought you were jumping in, Charles. This is just an interesting framework that a friend of mine, a guy, Nate Johnson, came up with this. Sorry, Nate Summers. And he's called it the survival resilient matrix. And, you know, people often tend to fall into one of these four quadrants. You know, people think of themselves as like, oh, I'm a permaculture person. And then there's people that are really into like ancient survival ways and naturalist knowledge, you know, the birders or the survival skills practitioners. And then you go over to the right there, there's, you know, like the preppers that are into like the modern tactical, like how do we survive the worst zombie apocalypse? And then we've got on the bottom there, we have like modern day emergency and disaster management. And, you know, Nate's philosophy that I thought was really brilliant, to actually truly create a resilient society, we actually want for ourselves, we actually want to have a little bit of knowledge and skill in all of these quadrants. And then within our community, we actually want specialists in all of these. And it shouldn't actually be a competition between, you know, is primitive survival more important or tactical prepper stuff? Is homesteading more important or modern emergency management? They're actually all valuable and they actually complement each other. And I think part of the holistic pathway is actually kind of bridging these worlds from that holistic lens. So there's just a kind of a thought there too around those skill sets. So we're going to come back to this one as well in a moment, but I'll just share, if the whole idea of earning income and opening up revenue streams with your permaculture skill sets is of interest to you, we are doing another webinar on January 24th. It's free as well, 1 p.m. PST. You can sign up on the Earth Activist page. And I'm actually going to be chatting about disaster preparedness as both a resume and a community builder. And don't get hung up on the revenue place, because maybe you're like, well, I'm not trying to earn revenue. You know, I have a job. Maybe you're retired, but maybe you just want to serve your community. Or maybe you work for an organization. You're like, hey, we want to improve our organization's capacity to be helpful in a disaster, or just be better prepared for ourselves in a disaster. Then this upcoming webinar might be interesting to you. So disaster preparedness is a resume and community builder, January 24th. It's free. You can sign up on the page. I'll save this one for the end, but I am running a 6-week online class starting January 28th on this concept of holistic emergency and disaster planning. And it's, yeah, I'll chat about that one as well, but I just want to highlight that that class is coming up. So one of the concepts in emergency management and permaculture is this idea of initial assessment. So in emergency management, we call it the initial assessment. In permaculture, we talk about observe and interact as one of the first principles. Before we start implementing permaculture concepts on the landscape, we want to observe what's already there. We want to tap into the ecology and the nature of that area, and we want to work with nature. So the framework I want to share with you today is this idea of mapping critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure is basically like the systems and the facilities, the technology, the networks, the assets, basically that serve health, safety, security, and economic well-being. So in Canada, you know, our government has actually identified 10 pieces of critical infrastructure that they consider the infrastructure for the country, that the country absolutely and their population relies on these things. And they're things like our water infrastructure, our safety infrastructure, our health infrastructure, our finance, transportation, energy. You're going to have the same needs, though, for yourself, whether you're a business or an organization, or whether you're an individual or thinking on a community level. So I did a consulting job for, I think they're on here tonight, Our Eco Village. This was actually a number of years ago, but I always use this as a great example. You know, we were working with Our Eco Village, and we said, well, what is the infrastructure of this eco village? Or you could say, what is this critical infrastructure of my community, my neighborhood, my family, my business? You know, and we talked about things like, oh, well, the water pump. We need that for the gardens. We need that for the people. The freezers that store our meat that we grow. The gardens and animals, yada, yada, yada. So what we're going to do right now is work on this concept called the risk assessment and mitigation tree. And I would encourage you to actually do this maybe tonight after dinner as a quick little exercise. Pull out a notebook and you can actually start doing this for your situation, whether you want to do it for your home, your family, your business, your festival that you run, whatever it is. So an example here is, what can be taken out what's a piece of critical infrastructure that could be affected by a superstorm, which was today's topic, right? These superstorms that we're having. Well, whether it's a fire, whether it's a flood, whether it's an earthquake, whether it's a hurricane, whatever the case, a tornado, one of the main things they're going to impact is electricity, right? And electricity, I'm going to use my home as an example. Electricity comes into my home. So do I just need some candles and a flashlight? Or do I need a little bit more? So the way that this assessment and mitigation tree goes is we look at the electricity coming in as something that could be disrupted by a disaster that we consider critical infrastructure. And then we map, well, where does that go once it comes into my home or into my community or into the festival I'm running or into my business organization? And if we start to map that across the landscape, we'll see it goes in lots of different directions. Well, it goes to my fridge and freezer. It goes to my lights. It goes to the stove that I use for cooking. It goes to communications, my phone and internet. It goes to appliances. Well, then where do those go? So it goes into my water pump, but then from my water pump, I need that water for sanitation, for staying clean. I need it to flush my toilet. I need it to water my garden. I need it to do my laundry. I need it to drink. And actually, it's not just me that needs it to drink. Well, I need it to drink, but our animals need it to drink as well. Our chickens and our rabbits need it to drink. Or if I look at the toilet, sure, it goes into the toilet, but then we also need something to flush that toilet and take that human waste out of the house afterwards, right? If you go down to communications, I think about, where do I communicate? Well, Laura is my wife, so I communicate with her with more than anybody else. So I need to communicate with my wife, especially if the disaster happens and my wife and I aren't together. That's one of the scariest scenarios for me. I wrote that in the chat when Charles asked, what do we think about with scenario? I've heard so many stories from wildfires, particularly. There was one here in Canada last year, Jasper Provincial Park, that basically has 2 roads going into it. And I heard stories of families that the fire came on so fast in some areas and the evacuation happened so fast that some people had so little notice, they had to leave within minutes and they weren't actually able to get back together with their family. So imagine there's so many calls going down, the communication systems are failing, so you can't actually call your spouse or your kids or your parents. And the town gets evacuated, there's no time, and there's 2 roads, and one family member goes north and the other family member goes south, and you can't get in contact with each other. And you don't even know if they made it out or not. You don't know if they're injured. You don't know what's going on. And it could be days before you have the ability to communicate with each other. That's a scary scenario to me. One of my biggest fears, because I actually feel like we're very prepared for a lot of scenarios. One of my biggest concerns is just not knowing how my family is doing in an emergency. So we can actually put things in place that will help mitigate and prepare us to actually have a plan if the phone stops working. So family, the other ones with communications, like, how do I call for help? Or being able to get relevant information, like what's actually going on? Maybe I smell something really weird in the air and everything seems fine, but it's like, that smell isn't good. Is this toxic for my health? Like, I need to be able to get external information in to know, do I need to go and shelter in place and like put plastic and duct tape over my windows right now? So there's a couple examples of this tree kind of branching out. Now, once we establish this tree, so you could literally so I just did it for electricity, but you could do it for water, you could do it for communications, you could do it for transportation, you could do it for safety, whatever you think is the critical infrastructure that you rely on. Once we've done that, we apply something we call the 4 pillars in emergency management. So could I prevent that critical infrastructure from being taken out in the first place? If I can't prevent the damage from happening, well, can I mitigate, like lessen the impact or prepare for it? How am I going to respond? And how am I going to recover afterwards? So let's go back to my example here. Well, can I prevent the electricity from not getting cut out to my home in the first place? Well, potentially, depending on your scenario. If you're in an apartment building, you might not have a lot of control over that. But some people, Charles talked about landscape design. And, choosing which tree species grow near your power lines might actually prevent a power outage in the first place. If we're thinking about this on a municipal level, it might even prevent large-scale blackouts. Some of you probably heard me say before, but there is one tree species in Toronto, the largest city near me, that's responsible for probably 80% of blackouts on power lines because it grows all over disturbed areas and its branches break really easy under ice and wind. And if our urban designers started thinking about landscape design along power lines, we would actually have way less power outages if we were planting oaks instead of Manitoba maples. So landscape design could actually prevent it. Another thing might be alternative power. If I have an alternative power system in the first place, solar or micro hydro or whatever, and I'm not attached to the grid and the grid goes out, well, I still have my power. Now, that could be taken out by something else, but it can be something that prevents you being affected by the larger grid going out. Now, what about mitigation? Well, yeah, so alternative power comes back at the end. So let's say the power is going out regardless. But if I have alternative power, whether it's a generator or it's solar or micro hydro, then I have a way to mitigate. So the power goes out, but I can mitigate against the problem by creating my own power. I can also mitigate these areas though. So for example, when I look at the communications tree here, I talked about the different things that could impact: chatting with my wife, my family, being able to call for help, getting info in. So I can actually now go, okay, well, I want to create a mitigation and a response plan at this level of communication as part of my critical infrastructure. And one way to look at this is, well, what's my primary communication in an emergency? What's my alternate? What's my contingent? What's my emergency plan, right? So for the primary one, having an emergency communications plan in the first place is huge. I highly, highly suggest one of the most high leverage things you can do is create an emergency communication plans for your family. And if you run a business or a public organization, you should probably have one for your organization or your business as well. And then my primary is, a lot of times emergencies, cell phones don't work. So having an emergency plan and having a mobile phone is my primary communication for a disaster. But what if the phone stops working, right? Well, then I might look at having like some apps, because maybe the phone signal is jammed, the bandwidth, because so many people are trying to do it, but I still have sporadic cell signals I can pick up on. And so I might be able to actually message loved ones through an app or a group. Or maybe I'm going to set up backup satellite communications, because maybe we have, 2003, some of you might remember, a huge part of Eastern Canada and the US, I think it was a transformer blew up in 2003. Tens of thousands, it might have even been millions of people without power for a number of days, up to weeks in some areas. Not that long ago, 2003, right? A scenario like that, transformer blows up on Earth, we lose cell signals down on the ground, but the satellites are still working. That didn't impact the satellite. Communicating through satellites is actually easier than ever. Now, whether that's sustainable, regenerative, that's a whole other story, but it is a tool that we have available to us, right? And then I have this idea of like contingent. Well, if none of if the app doesn't work and the satellite doesn't work, then we've actually arranged where we're going to meet, and I exit north and my wife exits south out of that town, and we can't get a hold of each other. Maybe we've arranged a person outside of that area that's going to pass on messages between us that we communicate through. And maybe there's a meeting place that we're going to rendezvous at, right? And, I go down to the emergency scenario, and this one is actually huge. Looking at all of these disasters, some of the hurricanes that have happened in recent times, I've heard from a few communities that one of the best tools that they had was two-way radios that they passed out amongst their neighbors. So all the neighbors could now coordinate through handheld radios when the phones weren't working, and actually coordinate a ground grassroots community response while they were waiting for other help to get back on the ground. I could do this example for other one, but here's an idea. So stove and cooking obviously is part of our thing, especially, if we have a boil water advisory. Maybe the municipal water I'm on gets contaminated, right? Or I need to collect rainwater because there's been a flood and all of the water for my entire city is contaminated. So I need to be able to boil that water. I also need to be able to cook my food. So, maybe my primary emergency might be like, okay, I have a camp stove and I can set it up on my back porch. If you're lucky, maybe your alternate is, well, I have a wood stove. But what if the storm takes out your chimney and the wood stove doesn't work? Well, maybe I could have an outdoor fire, or, in a real emergency, maybe I have the knowledge that I could literally go scavenge some tin cans and I could build a rocket stove. And I could cook on a tin can rocket stove with the tiny little twigs that I can salvage from the urban dead branches on urban trees. These aren't necessarily the answer. I'm just giving you an example of this thinking process. So basically, if you map out the critical infrastructure, so this one, electricity, where does it go? And then you can come up with mitigation strategies along each one of those points. So I'm going to kind of, we're going to do a question and answer in just a moment here, but I just want to kind of highlight these two opportunities really quickly. And then I'll pass it back to Charles, and then hopefully you'll stick around and we'll do a little bit of Q&A. So again, I already kind of mentioned this one, but if you're interested in this idea of actually developing this skill set for yourself, and potentially in a way that actually allows you more opportunities for earning revenue and building your resume, I think disaster preparedness skill sets on a resume is something that's going to look really good. Even if that's not your job in the organization, a lot of organizations now are developing safety committees. And some safety committees are going to be looking at storms and disasters as part of their, if we have a large, let's say we have 100 employees for this organization, and, the hurricane comes through or the earthquake while people are at work, how are we as an organization going to respond? And if on your resume it shows that, well, I actually have a skill set for helping with that, that could actually boost your chance of getting the job or making more money in that job by getting the raise. So I'll be talking about this on January 24th, 1 p.m. You can go to earthactivist.org to sign up, ORG. The other one that I really want to highlight, though, if you really want to go, because that free one is just like, it's just going to be an intro like tonight. We're going to just scratch the surface. We're going to plant a seed. But if you really are feeling a calling to go deeper with this, whether it's for just keeping your family safe, whether it's because you want your community or to be better prepared, whether you have an organization you work for and you want to increase your organizational's capacity to deal with it, maybe you run a festival, like a music festival, and you want to make sure that you have a plan for the music festival. If a crazy storm or a crazy event happens during the music festival, this is the course for you. We're going to be diving quite deep. And it's really about kind of developing that peace of mind that you have a solid plan, systems, and training in place if the unexpected happens. It's developing the confidence to have the tools to kind of serve your family, your community, your organization, farm, business. And this is actually building the resume. The other one introduces the concept of building your resume. This one is actually helping you do it by developing the skill set. So we're going to be covering a whole bunch of topics in this. We're going to be getting into this, like some of these frameworks for holistic emergency management. We'll be talking about resilient mindset and personal preparedness as well, but also diving deep into some of these tools. So I mentioned, the hazard identification and risk assessments, and there's a whole bunch of frameworks used in professional emergency management. So I'll be teaching you some of the best frameworks from that tool, and then how you can take those and apply them to your unique scenario, whether it's applying it to your family or your business, your organization, your festival or event, your farm, eco-village, etc. We'll be talking about community mapping and how to really organize amongst communities, and also thinking about like the diverse needs, that's a whole big topic on its own. How do we make it equitable? How do we make sure we take advantage of all the needs in our community, make sure everything's covered, make sure everyone's able to contribute in a good way. We'll be chatting about grassroots organization, a little bit about even the concept of decolonizing EM. And then one of the big components of this class is going to be you actually working on a real emergency plan that you'll be able to apply. And you can choose what you want to apply that to. We really encourage organizations to send a few staffs to this training, and then you can work on that plan as an organization. If you're a summer camp, maybe you're an eco-village, maybe you're a farm, you could send a delegate from your team to come, and they'll actually start working on that plan for your organization. But you could also just do the plan for your family or your neighborhood or your community or your NGO. We're also going to be talking a little bit about trauma-informed response, and the mental capacity of that. Starhawk's going to be a guest one night, and she's going to become talking about best practices for wildfires. And Starhawk will be sharing about trauma-informed response as well. We have Layla Darwish is going to be coming on, and she works in professional EM in BC. So we have a couple guests. Charles and I will be running it every week, but we have a couple great guest instructors, including Starhawk making a guest appearance. And then we're also going to be, one of my favorite parts actually is this idea of designing emergency exercise. And again, this is an employable skill. So once you've come up with a plan, you need to test it. And we do this through actually running mock disaster exercises. So we're going to run a couple mock disaster exercises as a group, which will be a ton of fun. But I'm also going to teach you how to design a mock disaster exercise that then you could run for your organization, your family, your business, or that, over time, as you develop your skill set, you could even develop into an employable skill. That's one of the things I actually get paid to do now, is organizations will hire me to come in and design a mock exercise for their organization to test the emergency plan and response. So I'm going to leave it there right now. That's everything I wanted to share. I'll pass it back to Charles in case he wants to add anything, and then we'll do a little bit of Q&A to finish things off.
Hello. Yeah, I don't have anything to add right now. I would like just open up to have a little bit of Q&A and maybe some conversation if there's things that are on people's minds.
Yeah, I'll throw in, I answer right away. The first one I saw when I turned it on, it was actually, I think, a private message. Pam said, the wood next to the house, is it a fire risk and termites? That's a great question, because if I lived in California, there's no way I would have that there. I'm actually in a relatively, quite a low fire risk area in the first place. And even the greater landscape around my area makes my place particularly protected. We're in these eastern woodland hardwood forests, so large out-of-control wildfires, although not impossible, are fairly unlikely in our area. So it is not a concern where I am, and thus I can have those piles of wood right behind the house. If I lived in other regions, I would not do it, and under certain conditions, I would move that wood. If we had a very, very dry summer, I would absolutely move it. We also don't have termites where I am. I'm very thankful. So, it's also important because, a lot of these solutions aren't one size fits all. That's why that observe and interact principle of permaculture is so important. We need to really work with our landscape. And the solutions I'm applying may not be the best solutions for where you live. And in the course, we're really going to be focusing on principles. So you can take the principle and apply it to whatever your unique scenario and situation is and adapt the actual solutions. So great one there I just wanted to speak to. So yeah, if anybody has questions about either the course coming up or from the class, Charles and I would love to have love to jam with you for a few minutes.
Yeah, it looks like we have a hand from Sheila and we have a hand from Pam. Maybe we'll take Pam first because we haven't heard from you yet.
Thank you. Thanks for answering my question about termites and fire. I lived in California for decades. Now I'm in Michigan. So I'm your neighbor across Lake Huron, Chris. And so my question is do you guys have experience with preparing our community to receive climate refugees? Maybe this is outside of the scope of this, but this is something. I've been a second-tier fire victim before when the house I was renting was sold to fire victims from Berkeley, Oakland Hills in 91. And so I kind of think that maybe not the people are going to give up on LA and come home to Michigan. And how do we first of all recruit permaculturists, please? Anyway, that's my question. How do we be helpful and also absorb people into our community in a way that's holistic?
Yeah, that's a huge question about climate refugees because, we're looking at LA and be like, okay, so what are people going to do? But when you look on a global context, also, we have this movement of climate refugees, and there's certain places that are predicted to be prime, and like center kind of US, center Canada are going to be areas that are, because they're not prone to some of the disasters. And the bulk of, when we think about disasters on a larger scale, the bulk of the population, global population, lives along the coasts. It's like 2/3, something like that. And when we talk about sea level rise and storms and all water runs from high places to low places. Where are the low places? They're on the shores. Where are the most people? On the shores. It's sea level rise versus shores. This is going to be hit. So island cultures, large cities on coasts. We're going to see people moving. And the question is, how do we create space for people to move? And part of it is going to be, how do we work our cities? Most people live in cities, so how do cities accept people in? Without destroying our ecology, which is the other part around development, right? When you develop, more people move to an area. Are you taking all the ag land and the forest land out, or are you going to be urbanizing? So it's a real question in your urban landscape, your region. How do you bring folks in? But I think it's an important one because we're going to have more and more people looking to live in safe places, and some of them are looking because they personally want to live there, and other ones because insurance is going to demand that you do not live in some places, and insurance is going to force people, especially if you don't have a lot of economic choices, to locate in a place that you can afford. And those are, I'm seeing some of that moving in. So yeah. I don't know if I have a good solution right now, but there's a conversation that is worth having. There's no easy answer right here. Yeah, Chris.
Yeah. The only other thing I'd add to that is that there's also like kind of a short-term and a longer-term conversation there too, right? Because as organizations, if you're part of a larger organization and not for profit, or even a community, there is ways on a grassroots level we can have conversations. Well, short-term, if something happens to our neighbors, how do we make sure we actually have the capacity to be helpful for that? And hopefully we have a conversation with them so they're doing the same with us. So in neighboring communities, we can be having conversations like, hey, if we all need to leave this area, do you have the capacity to hold us, and vice versa? And we are going to be getting into that kind of stuff in the course a little bit. We call that mutual aid within emergency management, but that's really kind of the shorter term one. Long term, it's a huge can of worms, and that's when you get into the political spectrum. That's not really the area I work in. I work a little bit more in the grassroots realm. Although Layla, who's going to be coming in as a guest, Darwish there, she works in that realm. And it gets really interesting. We're here in Canada, we're on one level facing that right now. We've had, just want to double check the time here. We got 15 minutes left, Charles?
Yeah. And we have 2 hands up, so.
Okay, great. Yeah, I won't spend too much time on this because I want to get to their hands. But, I'll give you an example here. So over the last number of years, Canada's taken in, a lot of refugees, but particularly many Syrian refugees. My mom is part of a community that's actually sponsored a bunch of these Syrian communities, Syrian people to come to their small town community. And there's some really beautiful things that have happened with that community sponsorship and the organization of it. But we're simultaneously in this area, the area I live in what has historically been a pretty small rural area surrounded by wilderness. We're seeing a massive explosion in population. Part of it driven by, the number of people coming in, new Canadians that are coming in, and which I'm supportive of that and being supportive for climate refugees. But the challenge is that we don't actually have the healthcare infrastructure for it. And we're seeing a very real impact on the ecology in this area and the infrastructure. And, I mentioned how I'm not particularly worried about wildfires. There's so many more people in the woods up here that the wildfire risk has actually gone up. And there's an example, like what we've done on a regional level here is not sustainable at all. And it's kind of disheartening. And it's not like, I'm not criticizing wanting to help people bring people in. I am absolutely criticizing how quickly we did it with how little forethought about how to do it in a way that's actually sustainable and serves people. So that is a very big can of worms you open up. But on a grassroots level, short term, I think there's definitely some stuff we could do. And some of that could probably evolve into some longer term purposes, like this idea of like, well, does our neighborhood have the ability to sponsor a handful of people to come in and actually support them in a really good way? And as I said, I've learned a little bit about that watching my mom. It's actually really amazing. I never had, this is a little tangent, but it's a beautiful story. I didn't have kids, and it broke my mom's heart. She wanted to be a grandma so bad. And there's this Syrian family that now call her grandma, and it means so much to her. And it kind of took the pressure off me and my wife, but it's also just a beautiful example of, more regenerative solutions, community sponsorship for climate refugees.
Yeah, I'm just going to add, because we should move to the next one, is there is the refugee piece, people moving. The other one's like, how do people return to the place they came from in a way that's responsible? So maybe, and there are places where instead of bringing people back to the home, this is just square burnt lot that you have, is to be like, no, we're actually resettling a different place. We're actually going to move and rebuild in a way that is responsible to the place. And you don't lose your community, because one of the things you lose, not just is like stuff, it's all your friends and neighbors. And when you have to when you're forced out and you fracture that community, it never comes back. So sometimes moving whole communities has happened, and some places very successfully, and some places it's been a real nightmare. So there's a lot of politics and privilege around that. Anyway, we should move on. Sheila, and then we have Our Eco Village. I think that's Brandy behind that, and hopefully we'll hear from her in a second. So Sheila, and then Brandy.
I'll try to be quick. I just want to point out that in general, I'm in the US, I'm in California, one of those places that's going to be blown up by water and fires and first of all, people are aging in droves. The baby boomers did not prepare for the fact that we now have better medicine and people are aging and we want them to age in place and all that, but people are not preparing for the disabilities that can come with age and how these man-made artifices, I should say, are not built for aging in place. And don't get me started on that healthcare and infrastructure and anyway. But I bring that up because you were talking about power earlier, and some people literally need power to breathe. And I love how I work in emergency preparedness. I'm not really management, but I these intersect. But the power thing is if you need power to breathe and you are not someone who can physically yourself run a generator and you need help, and maybe the help comes and maybe they don't, there's I just want to bring that up as a thing, and it happens as people age, and it happens as people gain more disabilities. I came into this life with one or two, and now I've got four or five, and I'm 53. And so, we have to think this. We have to think like this, and it's best if we think long term. And I want answers to that, but I also want to bring that up as a thing where if we don't have answers, we need to make them and create them.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that in, Sheila. I'm going to just connect your kind of comment there. Z wrote the last question in the piece there, and I think Z was asking a little bit more about the course, because we are going to touch on that in the course, but I want to answer that not just from the course, just from Sheila's perspective there, or at least speak to it. And I think a huge part of that comes into the community mapping and the neighborhood, resilient neighborhoods piece, right? And one thing that, a big practice that we can do in our neighborhoods is actually to build relations in the first place. So we actually think of each other as neighbors and it's not just a bunch of strangers and we don't know who lives over there and up above me and underneath, which that is a bit of a can of worms in this political climate as well. Although there is a lot of things that we can do to do that. I'll say that where I live, I don't have the same values as all my neighbors and we're all very solid, to use a bit of a stereotypical word, I'll definitely say that a couple of my neighbors are rednecks, gun-toting, beer drinking guys, and we get along just fine because of the way that I present myself with them. And I know that they have my back if anything goes wrong, and I have theirs. I can call my neighbor and be like, oh man, I forgot to turn the wood stove down. Can you run it over my house and check it and turn it down for me? So how I want to link that, though, to what you're saying there, Sheila, once you start to build those relationships, we have the ability to now map, okay, where are some of the challenges that maybe exist? Like maybe it's like, hey, the elderly couple that lives by themselves or the person that can't fire up that generator on their own. And we actually have a plan that, hey, and we know that that person doesn't have young family near them to come help. So as a community, can we actually make it part of our plan that someone's going to go check on them? And then the flip side of that is actually empowering that, not seeing that as and this is where I get a little frustrated when I talk about like decolonizing modern emergency management. In modern emergency management, we might call that a liability. But I don't like to think of that as a liability because there's a good chance that that elderly couple or that person that can't power the generator actually has a very useful skill set that they can apply to our thing. So it's not just that like, okay, we need to go help them. We want to actually empower what is their piece in the puzzle and what's the other person. So the young backs across the road can go over and pull the generator, but that person, maybe they're the one that young back might be the person that's having the mental crisis. And maybe that person with the disability that's been through so much has actually developed some real strong mental resilience. And they're now able to actually kind of coach the young back that fired up their generator through the stress and anxiety they're facing, That's kind of a hypothetical example. But I think that's where the neighborhood and community component and the grassroots part is really important. And unfortunately, that's the part that's often lacking in our modern emergency management. It's often very top down, and sometimes it's problematic and isolating. And we have the ability to kind of fill in that other piece from the grassroots up. And then I hope, Z, maybe that's answering your question a little bit. So we will be talking about kind of tools and thoughts around that. Layla is going to be talking to that specifically because Layla works in emergency management and particularly in kind of like mutual aid and grassroots organizations. Starhawk's going to be chatting about that a little bit. So we will be sharing kind of case studies of what people have done to do that. I'll be sharing some thoughts on community mapping tools as well as building relations kind of with neighbors and what we might even want to have in place for mutual aid. So hopefully that kind of speaks to both of those pieces.
And we have that is Brandy back there.
Can you see me somehow?
Yeah, there you are.
And
And the crew.
And the crew. We're sitting in the cold. We're in the 0 Mile Eatery. Oh, there we go. We got people from all over the world, different countries, different cultures. We're coming together. And as always, super grateful for both of you and Earth Activist Training in general. Chris Outdoors. I just brought in this question of, can you speak more about the social emotional emergency response component? We had the great privilege of doing a year-long emergency planning training here with y'all, Chris. And one of the things that came out of our Eco Villages design was the high level focus on well-being around emotional and social health and how to work with power dynamics and things that flare and trigger, especially in emergency response. And that just seems like a really brilliant component to add in these days. Well, crisis feels high. And again, thank you both.
Chris, you want to lead off on that one, or you want me to?
Sure. Either way. Sure. Are you going for it? Go for it.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Brandy. I think often in difficult times, it's the social emotional that makes or breaks it. Like, is it the individual challenge? It's usually how we work, how we're able to manage that and work together in it. It's like, can I cope? I know when I'm in those stressful moments, like when I am feeling confident, well-fed, rested, can take anything, right? And when I'm tired, disoriented, off, then it gets really hard. And I think it's a huge part of design. Like, how do we create these systems, as Chris was talking about, where we have the support to be able to do it? Disaster response is not a solo activity. Like, dealing in crisis is not a solo activity. It is a collective activity. It's an activity that we do together. And especially when we get into the community scale, it's one that we cannot do alone. And that we really, we can do these little pieces, we kind of design our own landscape and do our things. But when things hit and things come down, it is how we work together. Do we have communication systems? Do we have the emotional support? Do we have the medical, and I'm not just talking about physical, but do we have the capacity? And sometimes it is training. Do you have a therapist you can be? But sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just like, somebody who's been around enough to sit down and talk with you or help you through. Do we have the networks that allow that to happen? I think it's a critical part of it. And as Chris was going through his outline, you can see there's whole classes that are about, pieces that are about how do we design that kind of trauma-informed response? How do we engage when we're having a tough time? And what do we have in our kits to do it? If you need chocolate to survive the hard day, it might just as be important as a Band-Aid. If a beer is as important as, anything else sometimes, how do we get our emotional selves, our social selves? Like, what is it that you need? And being able to track that down. So that we're not just thinking about the kind of food, water, shelter, but it's those other pieces that make us successful or fail, I think. And when I was in New Orleans after the big storms there, or in Vermont after the big storms there, the things that really made the communities that did the best are the ones that could work together and socially had cohesion. And the ones that did the worst were people isolated.
Sure, I'll add a little bit more to there. I actually just made another slide literally while you were talking there. So I'm going to pull that up. Brandy, I'm sure you could speak to this topic at length as well. So, but I know you're probably just interested to hear what other folks say, but I bet you could answer this question with some beautiful ideas. That'll be for another time. So it's a huge topic. And it actually, if we were to actually do like a hazard identification and risk assessment for the world, like what are the things we're concerned about? The social divide right now is actually at the top of the things that I'm concerned about. And if we were to map, that tree that I did, the mitigation tree, we could actually start with social divide and say, where does that ripple out across society? And then we could work backwards and say, well, are there ways that I can prepare, mitigate, prevent? I think it's a huge answer. I don't necessarily have a lot of thoughts on doing it at scale. I have a lot of thoughts on doing it on a grassroots level again, though. So I just kind of wrote these down, and bear in mind, I just threw these off the top of my head. So I would like to refine this a little bit more. But I think there's some major components when we talk about that here. So one idea is the idea of nonviolent communication and actually learning how to, have conversations under stress in the first place. And there actually is a skill set around how do I do that. One thing I actually kind of remember from, I'm going to stop that actually just so you're not distracted by the slides. But when I was working with our eco village, one thing that kind of came up, and I think you maybe remember this. So we were doing an emergency exercise drill, which of course creates a lot of stress. And what happened, our eco village usually works in this very kind of consensus-based format. Consensus-based format is sometimes quite slow moving and needs to account a lot of stuff. And sometimes in disasters, things actually need to happen really quickly. And then, of course, you have a bunch of intelligent people in the room with different ideas. Everyone has different ideas and everyone wants to weigh in. Everyone sharing their idea may also prevent us being able to respond at the pace we need to. Now, there's times in that preparedness cycle where it's important to hear all voices. There's actually times where we just need to get shit done and somebody needs to take charge and kind of delegate in certain scenarios, right? Now, to be able to have somebody kind of, for lack of better words, bark orders at you actually takes a certain amount of like personal shadow and grief work, to not actually take it personally, to not be offended. So I remember when we were doing this drill, we actually had to call a quick little pause. And I don't remember exactly what I said, but I remember it did kind of land with the group. And we kind of talked about two things. One we talked about is like, hey, there's actually probably 10 ways we could solve this problem right now, but it needs to happen fast. So if somebody is starting on a plan, unless your plan, unless that person is like missing something drastic that's going to cause to loss of life or major damage, their plan doesn't actually have to be the best plan in this unique scenario. And, part of your shadow work is like, oh, I want to say this is the better plan, but I actually have the resolve to hold back and say, you know what? I think my idea is a better idea, but this needs to happen. And their plan is probably going to work and do it. So we're just going to go with that because it's already moving in that trajectory. So there's this like certain level of like self-assessment that we need to develop to be able to be in those situations in the first place. And then the other one is recognizing that, we can strive for consensus decision-making. And in certain scenarios, where things are, when the fire is on our doorstep, the person who has the most experience with fire prevention and response should probably just tell people what to do. And I should probably just listen to them, which might challenge me if I'm the type of person that doesn't like the idea of hierarchy. I personally believe temporary hierarchy under stress in certain scenarios is actually essential. And it doesn't mean hierarchy where like suddenly when this is all over, that person keeps telling me what to do. It's like under this situation, I recognize Charles knows more about this than I do. And I'm just going to do what he tells me without saying much because it needs to happen fast. And the only time I'm going to open my mouth is if I think Charles' plan is going to hurt somebody or make the scenario worse. And if I don't think it's going to be or maybe it's even like, it might even hurt something a little bit, but it's a little bit. And we're talking about a lot of hurt right now. So it's actually not worth me saying something. So to go back to my slide here right now, I hope you're kind of following me with this idea right here. To be able to have those kinds of conversations, we actually need to do our own grief work, our own shadow work, our own ego work. And there's something to doing that within communities. And we need people that can actually facilitate that work as part of holistic emergency management. Our communities going through those pieces, those relate to how we're going to communicate, but they're also going to relate to whether we get overcome with an anxiety and fear or not. And this is where that part I have in the north right now, this empowerment and vision piece, and I stared, I look at really terrible world scenarios day in and day out as part of my work. I'm always looking at the worst as part of what I do. And I'm generally a very positive person. And And part of that is I feel like I have a personal vision, like part of why I've been put here on this planet is to do this work. And thus I can look at those heavy things and still be empowered and still even be positive. Not everyone is necessarily meant to deal with the nitty gritty and look at it, but I personally believe that everybody has a role in the world, and knowing what your role in the world is, what your true gifts are, and having that recognized in your community empowers that role in challenging times. And, in our society today, I wasn't brought up in a community or a family that recognized things like rites of passage or even it was like, what job do you want to have when you grow up? And it was often based around kind of a balance between money and happiness. That's very different than like, what is your vision and gift as a human being? And when we can, like in our youth and young adults, bring out like their vision, then suddenly it's not a job. Like, I don't care about my 15-minute break, that I get 2 15-minute break and a half an hour lunch when I'm working. Like, I'm here to do real work in the world, and it supersedes kind of the infrastructure that world's put on top of me of what a job is. I think to empower people in that kind of way, that what they're doing is actually part of their vision and gift, and it's recognized by the community, directly relates to how well you're going to respond with the anxiety, the grief. Partner that with the shadow grief work, partner that with the nonviolent communication skill set. And then the other one I'll weave through there is this idea of mythology. And I'll maybe leave this as kind of my closing thought, because I know we want to wrap up here. But something I've been thinking a lot about, if we look at cultures around the world, kind of pre-colonization, mythology recognized the beauty of the world. And, the world had destructive forces, forest fires, earthquakes, ice ages for a long, long time. But we also had entire mythologies that just honored the sacred and in the beauty of the world. So I think there is something to, reconnecting with our mythology and maybe even some of these ancient stories and giving us wisdom in the modern times, and feeling that we're actually an active part of this mythology and this deep relationship with the land and what is sacred. And when I have a sacred relationship with the land and a sacred relationship with my community, I'm going to step up in a different way in the face of challenge. And even if I'm full of anxiety and fear, mythology and that sacredness gives me a power to overcome that and work through it. So that's a huge piece right there, but there's kind of my little take. And and that's all off the top of my head, just so, I could probably refine that model a little bit.
Well,
Thanks, Brandy.
We've come to our time. And I just want to thank everybody. I want to say thank you to Chris for presenting so beautifully. Thank you to everybody for coming, and for those who are watching the recording. Thank you for all caring, because I think this is a big issue, and one that we're going to continue to face. So come join us, either Earth Activist Training for some of the courses that we got going on, or join your own groups that are in your communities. But I thank you for stepping in and being curious and making a difference in the world. So big blessings to everybody.
Yeah, and just a reminder, if those two offerings are of interest, go to earthactivist.org, and we've got the free webinar on there, and that emergency disaster course details are up on there starting in a couple of weeks.